I wanted to do a quick little video because, as I was mentioning in my last video, my Nikon D3s is my primary camera. The D3s is a camera I've wanted since I first got into photography. To give you a really super brief history, I've always liked mechanical things in general, whether it's engines and cars, guns, tools, typewriters, anything that has like good engineering and cool mechanics behind it, I appreciate. And one of those things is old cameras. It's part of the reason why I like old film cameras. It's just from the build standpoint, just the cool little gears and dials and levers, and it's just cool, right? I also like history, so that makes sense, and I'm a big fan of art in general, in several mediums. So photography is kind of a good collection of those things. Now, my great-grandpa was an artist. He was also a photographer. Like back in the day, I think he had a Hasselblad. I know he had a Raleigh, a few other random cameras, but he actually did pro photography back in the day before it really developed into what it is today, obviously. And one of the old cameras he had, which I've mentioned in a few other videos, and I was talking to David Chan about when I was in Hong Kong, was this old Miranda camera. And nobody knows about Miranda these days, but Japanese camera, and it was an old SLR, but it was just, I could ramble too long, so I'm going to kind of skip over that, but it's a camera I had never seen before, never heard of, nobody else has ever heard of, but it's an amazingly well built, just expertly crafted, amazing camera. And it was my great grandpa's. He used it who knows how many times. Who knows how many times the shutter's been actuated, and what it's seen and what it's been through. But my grandpa died when I was a kid. Well, my great grandpa died when I was a kid, and my mother was really close to him, and she always loved anything related to him. So when she was in college, she went for her bachelor's degree in fine arts. When she was younger and she was in college, she actually used his old Miranda camera for the portion of her classes where she had to do like the photography courses. She ran black and white film through it, and that was the camera she used. And I remember as a kid seeing those images, like her getting the photos back and seeing very specific photos. I actually remember one photo that I looked at and it really drew me in, and it kind of just really fascinated me, just the composition and how it looked and what it was. I couldn't figure out at the time, and then I liked the way it looked, and I asked her what it was, and she said that she had gone to the grocery store and dropped the camera down at a low point, and she saw all the grocery carts stacked one in front of another, all pushed together, and over the top of the carts you can see the different handles and cart, all the rows of repetitive patterns of the metal coming together. And she had brought it down low, and with that exposure setting and that black and white and those repetitive patterns and shapes, and then the bokeh involved with where she focused, you couldn't just see what it was by looking at it, but it was very pleasing to the eye. It was very good to look at. And I remember being fascinated with the idea of photography. I remember going out and buying a disposable camera, and actually, as a child, I used my own money that I literally scraped together. I went around the house and found pennies and this and that, and walked the street, find a nickel. I scraped together money to get a couple of dollars, and I bought a disposable camera. And I remember going to this park that was by my house. I grew up in Indianapolis. I was on the east side, and this park was called Ellenberger Park. And I remember walking through the park, trying to find creative photos I could take as a kid with a disposable camera. I remember going down to the creek and walking through the trees that are by the water, and it was still cold outside at the time, so there was some ice and some snow, but things had started to melt a little bit, and there were some colors coming through. And I remember trying to take up close photos of like flowers, and I saw a squirrel, and I took a photo of that thing over there, and I actually never got that roll of film developed. I couldn't afford that, and who knows whatever happened to that camera. But since I was a kid, I thought about photography and cameras and thought they were very cool and was influenced by them early on. When I got older, around the time I started high school, this was, early 2000s, my dad was one of the early adopters of digital. He started his own event photography business called KZ Productions, and he started buying up digital cameras. Now this, I think his first camera that he bought, like digital camera, must have been like 2003, 2004. It was pretty early, really early in the whole digital thing, right? But they were Olympus cameras, and the first ones were those weird brick-shaped, didn't even look like an SLR. It was just a really weird, awkward thing, like the E-Volt 300. I don't even know if that was the right one, but just weird-looking cameras. But as new models came out, he started buying them up, and he ended up buying a whole bunch of gear, lighting and backdrops and cameras with backup cameras and lenses and everything else. And he started doing his little photography thing as a hobby, and then doing it more and more. And it got to the point where every time I was getting into something as a kid, whether my first car, or I started getting into powerlifting, I started going to competitions and competing, or anything related where a parent would want to take photos, my dad was the guy with the really big, expensive, cool-looking camera gear. And I always thought it was cool and fascinating, but I didn't want to approach it too close because I was very worried that I might overstep and accidentally damage one of these very expensive cameras. But as a funny side note, to this day my dad still has all his old Olympus stuff. It's like an Olympus E3. I think he's got several of them, and a main body and some backups. Each of them have a different lens on it, and he still uses them to this day. He thinks that new cameras are amazing and crazy, but he doesn't even really keep up to date on what all the newest cameras can do. He the way he views it is that his old cameras, the photos they take now, are just as good as they ever were, and they still work, so he's going to keep using them, which I think is very admirable. But anyway, I remember my dad showing me like the power of digital photography with these old Olympus cameras on his computer. I remember him bringing a photo up and him zooming in, and he was like, look at this, you can make out every single individual hair. And I saw that, I could see the pores on the skin, the hairs, and I thought, oh my god, like, this is insane, this is incredible, you know? And that was back with, like, a long time ago, right? So, and that was him shooting JPEG at the time, like unedited JPEGs at a camera, and we were amazed by the quality. So, again, it's not always about the gear, it's about who it is behind the camera, right? I didn't personally decide that I was actually going to start purchasing cameras and educating myself on photography until I came to Taiwan. Before I came to Taiwan, this was probably the very start of 2013, I decided that before I went, I was going to buy whatever cheap camera I could with some store credit that I had, and I ended up with like a Sony point and shoot. And it wasn't like an RX100, it was something else, some small center, like HV, whatever. And I hated it, it's a piece of crap. But I came to Taiwan and I tried to take some photos. I didn't like it. But being in Taiwan, there's a huge camera culture here. So I pretty quickly started accidentally walking by all these camera shops, both new and used, and seeing these cameras and up close and seeing the price and kind of figuring out, like, you know, I can buy a camera. I could buy like a real big boy camera all for myself. It would be mine. And it's like, it was the first time it clicked in my head that, like, I don't have to admire my dad's gear or see the other guy using it and think, he must be a pro. Like, I can get my own real camera. That's amazing. And I remember just going back to our little studio apartment that we had when we first got here and just starting to research like crazy, Googling everything. And of course, I didn't know anything about brands. The only brand I was familiar with other than Olympus, because that's what my dad shot, was I knew about Nikon. Oddly enough, Nikon must have great branding, because even when I didn't know anything about cameras or manufacturers or gear or anything, I knew about Nikon, and in my head a real camera is what I would refer to as, you know, like a Nikon. You know, a Nikon style camera. I didn't even know they were called SLRs or DSLRs. I was like, you know, like the Nikon style of cameras, you know, the professional cameras, the Nikons, you know. So as a child who didn't know anything, I knew about Nikon being professional. So they've done good marketing apparently. But anyway, eventually, I started buying cameras, and I think my very first camera I ever bought was the Sony A55. I'll probably do a whole different video of the cameras I've owned over the years and kind of what I learned from each of them in my evolving thought process. It's fun for me to think back on it, but what I'm kind of getting to with this video, because it's already dragging out a little longer than I wanted it to, was that very, very early on, like when I first got to Taiwan in early 2013, and I was trying to figure out like what the best camera is just kind of a marker and seeing like what cameras were, what's considered the best camera. One of the things I kept seeing over and over and over again was the Nikon D3s. And at this point the D4 had already come out, but most people were still shooting with the D3s, and a lot of the comparisons were still against the D3s. And over the years, as I learned more about cameras and photography and the tech specs and the composition aspects and all these different things, one thing that never faded, even as new cameras would come and go and were loved and hated, was that the D3s always remained like a favorite camera with everybody. Everybody seemed to admire it and love it and appreciate it and respect its abilities. When a new camera would come out, it would inevitably be at some point be compared to the D3s, and everything I read about this camera made me think like, man, if I could only own that camera someday, that would be amazing. But I'll never be able to afford it. $6,000 camera, it's body only, like I can't, it'll never happen. I wasn't even sure if I'd ever have a full frame camera. But eventually prices come down with time, and eventually I was able to buy one. And I didn't even buy it. What it was that I was trying to sell off my gear because, like I was saying in my last video, financial times, struggling a little bit, and I was starting to sell off my gym equipment that I had made or purchased, and I was selling off tools and other things, and I was doing some side jobs, and I started selling off all my extra camera gear that I thought was worth selling. With some stuff I know that it's going to be very hard to sell, and I'm also going to get so little for it that it's not worth it to sell. It's worth more to me to just keep it, right? But if I was able to get some money for some of my photography gear, I was starting to sell stuff. And I had purchased the Fujifilm X-T30, ended up not liking it for various reasons. I did a review on it with DP Review actually, and I ended up selling that, only lost a couple, well maybe like less than $100 on the deal, because it was still basically brand new. And then I took that money, turned right around and purchased an XH1 with battery grip combo for a steal of a deal. They were clearanced out basically. And then although I really liked that camera and I was sure I was going to keep it, there were a few nagging issues that were serious enough that I decided I can't keep this camera. And that's a more extensive review that I also put on DP Review. But I decided to sell the XH1, and I had a guy, he said, "Are you open to trades?" And I was like, "Oh, okay, what do you got?" And he said, "Well, I don't know if you're into it or not, but I've got a Nikon D3s." What? Well, I mean, I got a Nikon D3s I can trade you. And I said, "What's the deal? What's the catch? What's going on?" Because they still fetch a fair price here in Taiwan. And he was like, "There's nothing wrong with it. And like, if you look over this camera, it's dirty right now, but I mean, it's not banged up, it's not scratched up. You'll see some dirt here and there. It's like some smears, some fingerprints, but it's in remarkably amazing shape. It's got 170 something thousand on the shutter, less than 175, like 172 or something like that. And it came with 2 batteries in the original box and all the paperwork and the factory charger and all this stuff, right? So he said he'd trade me straight out. He would actually come down from Taipei. He would travel down here to meet me, and I could test the camera out and see if I liked it, and he would trade me just straight up, no money exchange. And I thought, I was really needing to sell my Fuji, but this might be the only opportunity I have, at least for the next long time, to own a D3s. So I said, okay, and I figured, I'll use it for a little bit, but then eventually I'll sell the D3s, and after I've used it and had some fun, I'll sell it, and I'll make my money off of this camera. But I fell in love with it. It was even better than I ever imagined it would be. I was very hesitant, and I thought that I was going to feel the age, that it was going to be so apparent to me that this camera was a pre-2012 camera, But this doesn't show its age at all. The only way you really notice the age of this camera is if you bought it for video. Then you're going to be upset because it shoots 720 video. But even with that, even though it's not a video camera, I must admit that I took a few videos with this camera. Like at my son's performance, I had my 80-200 lens on here, and I was zoomed in so I could see the stage, and I was recording a quick video. And I was actually really surprised at the quality of the video, considering it's such an old camera and it shoots 720. And the other thing that surprised me is that the built-in microphone on here is surprisingly good and punchy, and it's probably because it's right here and it faces forward towards the person talking to it, when you want to record yourself. It also has headphone input. Surprisingly good, considering it's not meant for that. But even cool little details I never noticed during reviews I started to really love. Like this little screen down here with these dedicated buttons for ISO and quality and white balance became such an amazing thing. The fact that there was this two-stage lock, that in order to get to the memory cards, you would slide your thumb right in there and flip up this little dial. I'll show you. And then you'd push this button. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but there's a little button right in there. Maybe you can see it. So you would, just when you're holding the camera, you just slide your thumb under that tab. Just has a little groove cut out, pops right in. And then you push down on that button, and that's when the door opens up. And you see both of your CF cards. Now I have a CF card, and then I have an adapter in there that's like a CF to SD adapter, but I remember taking photos with this thing, and even at 12 megapixels, the quality of those 12 megapixels is so insanely good that I was zooming in 100% and thinking that what I was seeing at the 100% zoom was a workable photo. It was like that could be its own photo. The quality is good enough. It's very detailed still. It's amazing. But now comes to the point of this video. I had said in a couple videos ago when I was doing my review of this camera that I'm recording with, the EX2F, that I was going to do a whole dedicated review of the D3s. However, still struggling financially, unfortunately, and it's not a problem. I'm not in trouble or anything, but things are a little tighter than I want them to be, and making responsible decisions. And the responsible decision is that as much as I love photography, it's a hobby. I don't make money with it. And as much as I love this camera, it's just a camera. I can always buy another one. So, the responsible thing is for me to now say, it's time to part with this camera and finally sell it. I don't want to. I'm gonna miss it. The ergonomics of this camera are perfect to me. The balance is perfect. The button placement is perfect. I'm blown away with the image quality all the time. I used to always read in those early reviews about how there was a certain quality to these flagship bodies that is hard to relay in a review. Like, you don't know it until you get your hands on it. And I never put too much credit to that. I always assumed that, they're being biased. They're trying to convince themselves that $6,000 was worth it when they bought the camera. When all these newer cameras are coming out that are newer and smaller and lighter and cheaper and lower end, but on paper they have better performance than these cameras, they have better specs. The people who buy these cameras at the still elevated prices are just looking for a way to justify their purchase. That's why they say dumb things like, oh, you don't know the quality, oh, it's just different, you'd have to feel it. I never bought into that stuff. But now I'm kind of eating those words because I have to admit, as a guy who loves old tech and new tech, somebody who loves all cameras, I've owned an insane number of them now. Somebody who just did a video going on about how awesome this point and shoot from 2012 is. I mean, I am the guy that appreciates budget camera gear, cheap used stuff, old stuff, everything else. I'm that guy. I'm not the guy who has ever owned a Leica. I'm not the guy who would buy a $6,000 camera brand new. I've never owned or shot medium format. I'm not the big budget photographer, but I've got to say, it is true what they've always said. Something about this camera, and honestly I don't know what it is, there's just something about it. The way the light reflects off it, as dumb as that sounds, just the finish, the overall like physical finish, the way it feels in your hand, not just the texture but the weight and the balance, how the buttons feel when you press them, the response of the dials, little things like this, like everything just is so finely tuned, so expertly, precisely put together. And the battery life, just it never dies. A single battery will give you over 4,000 shots. And I've got a backup battery right here. Like, my wife even made a comment where she said, after I'd had this thing for a few weeks, she said, "Have you ever charged your camera?" And I said, at that time I said, yeah, like once. Why? She said, well, I'm used to seeing you charge your cameras like at the end of every day or every couple days. But you've had that camera for a little while now and I've never seen you charge it. Yeah. Even just the way the files respond in Lightroom. It's one thing to see a DxO test chart or to compare tech specs, but it's another thing to actually handle the files in Lightroom. I have actually gotten photos that I took at 102,000 ISO, and I'm not exaggerating. I have photos on my computer that I took at 102,000 ISO, and they're keepers. To me, they don't look perfect, they don't look technically awesome, but they actually look pretty good overall. And if you're the average person just looking at the photo, you wouldn't see anything wrong with it. Only if you're a photographer looking for imperfections would you spot some obvious problems, but aside from that, you'd never know. Just, it's like the best camera I've ever owned. I love this camera. And someday, I might own it again. I hope I do. Because greatness does not have an expiration date. I'm going to go ahead and, because I can't do a proper review of this camera, what I'm going to do is, if you check the description down below, I'm going to attach a link to my DP review post, my user review of this camera. You won't be seeing an official review on this camera because it's time that I sell it. Bills need to be paid, other projects need to be funded. In the meantime, I still have my Samsung EX2F. It's been a good ride. The D3s. Maybe consider owning one. And if you never own one, if it's not your thing, you don't want to experience it, maybe when somebody who does own one talks about how much they love it even to this day and how it holds up today and the quality is just as good and they seem to be in love with it, maybe don't think they're full of shit. Maybe believe them, that love is real. It's a phenomenal camera. Best camera I've ever owned, hands down. By far. I don't know. Alright. Time to pack this stuff up. Thanks for watching.